The New Journalism literary movement in the 1960s to the 1970s, presented by Kelsey Warfield. New Journalism, background information. New journalism was an American literary movement that took place in the 1960s and 1970s. Those credited with beginning the New Journalism movement include Tom Wolfe, Gay Talese, and Truman Capote. New journalism combined journalistic research with fiction writing in which reporters would create stories about real-life events. Style and genre of new journalism. Similar to traditional journalism, writers would immerse themselves in their work by focusing and spending time observing their subjects for weeks or even months at a time. During this time, they would gather the facts and research needed to complete their work through interviews and observation. The final result, however, is what made new journalism stand out. Instead of using the typical journalistic structure and stereotypical voice and tone, new journalists created characters, used dialogue, created vivid scenes, and developed plot lines that included dramatic tension. Their writing style, in addition to the time and money that went into their research, did not fit the usual needs or budgets of most newspapers. Instead, many new journalists had to publish their own stories in anthologies or write nonfiction novels. Characteristics of new journalism. There are 4 characteristics of new journalism writing. The first being scene-by-scene construction, which is similar to that of a traditional novel. The second is the use of third-person point of view, which is a way to give the reader the ability to enter the mind of the character. The third being the use of full dialogue instead of selective quotes like traditional journalism. Lastly, the inclusion of symbolic details such as the explanation of characters, gestures, interests, and choices. Major social issues of the 1960s included the JFK presidency and assassination, which led to the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. In 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon after the Kennedy Space Center launched the Apollo program. The Vietnam War, which divided the nation. Some people protested in the streets while others fled the U.S. in order to avoid the draft. The remaining formed the silent majority, a group that supported the war. The Civil Rights Movement. This included the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination in public places, and the Voting Rights Act, which eliminated poll taxes and literary requirements. These, however, did not eliminate racism or solve the problems African Americans were facing. Major social issues of the 1970s included the Nixon presidency, the environmental movement, which included the passing of the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act, the fight for women's rights, the anti-war movement, and the Watergate scandal, which led to the resignation of President Nixon. Religious issues of the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1950s, religious membership, church funding, and traditional faith and practice all increased. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, however, things began to change. Social movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Sexual Revolution, and the Vietnam War began to challenge the traditional church. This is because new alternative religions like Buddhism and Hinduism began to emerge. The emergence of these new religions led to a decrease in institutionalized Christianity. This also led to a more diverse and complex religious scene. Economic issues of the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1960s, the publication of The Other America by Michael Harrington highlighted the increase in poverty that the U.S. experienced. This, among other things, contributed to the war on poverty that was created by politicians. Kennedy's tax cuts were credited with stimulating economic growth and an increase in employment and profit. The cost of the Vietnam War continued to increase, and Lyndon B. Johnson's The Great Society implemented programs like Medicare that reduced poverty and improved public health. The cost for these programs, however, continued to increase rapidly. In the 1970s, the U.S. entered a recession. This recession included an energy shortage, which occurred because of the worldwide oil shortage, high inflation, which was also caused by the oil shortage, in addition to a mix of high demand and low supply, and high employment was caused by the return of soldiers from Vietnam and women in the workforce. New journalists, like traditional journalists, use current and historical events as the subjects of their writing. Capote, like many new journalists, wanted to write about real-life events in a way that incorporated the excitement and drama that is lost in traditional journalism. A few examples of new journalism include Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Like all new journalism, The Right Stuff and In Cold Blood tell the stories of true events while including dramatized plot lines and dialogue. The Right Stuff tells the story of the American space program, which evolved from Wolf's own curiosity about the people who are willing to fly into space. It contains facts and descriptions of true events, while also incorporating and recreating conversations and thoughts that people in that situation may have had. Similarly, In Cold Blood tells the story of the murder of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas. The novel tells the story of the family's murder while also incorporating the events that led to the death of the 4 family members. New journalism revolutionized the way news and events are reported. It pushed the boundaries of traditional journalism and nonfiction writing by incorporating journalistic techniques like research and fiction writing techniques. Works cited.